Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to watch the people you love bury you while you're still breathing? Stay until the end because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about the day I came back and found my own funeral already over. The first thing I saw wasn't my family. It was my own photograph sitting beside a coffin covered in white flowers. People dressed in black stood around crying while a pastor spoke about the wonderful life I had lived. My mother wiped away tears. My brother hugged guests. My father accepted condolences. The only problem was, I wasn't dead. My name is Thabani Nkosi. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a logistics engineer on offshore cargo projects along the African coast. My assignments often take me far from home, sometimes without reliable communication for weeks. My family always complained that I cared more about work than them, but I never imagined they would erase me before I even had the chance to come home. Standing outside that church, listening to strangers describe my life in the past tense, I realized something terrifying. This funeral wasn't a mistake. Someone wanted the world to believe I was gone. Few weeks before everything fell apart, I received an urgent phone call from my company. An important offshore cargo project had run into serious problems, and they needed experienced engineers immediately. The job was dangerous, far from the mainland, and expected to last several weeks. Before leaving, I sat with my family and promised them that the extra money from this assignment would help us pay our debts and finally bring some peace into our lives. They thanked me, hugged me goodbye, and told me to stay safe. Looking back now, I wonder if any of those smiles were real. The first few days at sea went exactly as planned. I managed to send a few short messages whenever the satellite signal was strong enough. Then everything changed. A powerful storm swept across the coast, damaging communication equipment on our vessel. Satellite phones stopped working, internet connections disappeared, and even emergency systems became unreliable. Our captain told us that contacting anyone on land would be almost impossible until repairs were completed. We had no choice but to focus on surviving the harsh weather and finishing the mission. While I was fighting heavy waves hundreds of miles from shore, something far more dangerous was happening back home. Without waiting for any official confirmation, my family began telling everyone that I had disappeared at sea. They claimed they had lost all contact with me and feared the worst. Soon, neighbors, relatives, and even old classmates were hearing the heartbreaking story that Thabani Nkosi was probably dead. The strange part was that no government office had confirmed my death. No rescue team had reported finding anything. There wasn't even an official missing persons investigation. Yet somehow my family spoke with complete confidence, as if they already knew I would never return. Their version of events spread quickly because people trusted them. Nobody imagined they could be lying about something so serious. Some of my closest friends felt something wasn't right. They asked why there were no official reports and why nobody from my company had contacted them. Every question was met with excuses. My family claimed the authorities were still gathering information and asked everyone to respect their privacy during such a painful time. Most people accepted those answers without asking anything else. Out on the ocean, I had no idea that my life was already being rewritten. While I struggled to get back home alive, the people I trusted most were quietly convincing the entire world that I would never return. When our ship finally reached the mainland, I felt nothing but relief. The storm was behind us, the mission was complete, and all I wanted was to go home. I imagined calling my family, surprising them at the front door, and telling them everything that had happened. I had no idea that my real nightmare was only beginning. The first strange thing happened when I tried to switch on my phone. It couldn't connect to my number. I thought it was just a network problem, so I visited my mobile provider. After checking their records, the employee looked at me with confusion and said my phone number had been permanently disconnected weeks ago. According to their files, the account owner was no longer active. I laughed nervously, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake, but the employee simply apologized and said there was nothing they could do. Feeling uneasy, I walked to the nearest bank to withdraw some money. My card was rejected the moment I inserted it into the machine. Inside the branch, another employee checked my account and suddenly became very quiet. She explained that all my accounts had been frozen because official records showed that I was deceased. My hand started shaking. I kept repeating the same words. I'm standing right here. I'm alive. The staff looked shocked, but they said only the legal department could remove the restrictions. I rushed to my apartment, hoping at least my home would make sense. Instead, I stood frozen outside my own front door. The locks had been changed. Through the windows, I could see that every piece of furniture was gone. The place where I had built my life looked empty, as if I had never lived there at all. One of my old neighbors recognized me and nearly dropped the shopping bag she was carrying. Her face turned completely pale. She whispered my name as though she had seen a ghost. Before I could explain anything, she burst into tears. She told me everyone believed I had died during my offshore assignment. She even said my family had already accepted visitors, received condolences, and spoken about me as if my story had ended forever. I walked through my own neighborhood like a stranger. Every familiar face stared at me with fear, disbelief, or confusion. My phone was gone. My money was locked away. My home had been emptied. My entire life had disappeared while I was still breathing. In that moment, I realized someone hadn't simply reported me missing. Someone had erased me completely. I knew I couldn't walk straight into my family's house. Too many questions filled my mind, and I needed answers before anyone knew I was back. So I stayed out of sight and quietly watched the people I once trusted. Early the next morning, I noticed several relatives dressed in black climbing into their cars. My parents were among them, and my brother carried a large bouquet of white flowers. Something about the way they looked made my stomach tighten. I decided to follow them from a distance. Their cars stopped outside a church I had visited many times as a child. The parking lot was already full of people. I stood behind a large tree near the entrance, making sure no one could see me. As guests walked inside, I heard soft music and quiet crying coming from the building. My heart began beating faster with every step I took toward the open doors. Then I saw it. Right at the front of the church stood a large framed photograph of me. It was one of my old family pictures, placed beside a polished wooden coffin covered with beautiful white flowers. My name was written across a memorial banner, followed by the words, "Forever in our hearts." For a moment I couldn't breathe. I stared at my own face while people walked past it, shaking their heads with sadness. I wasn't looking at someone else's funeral. I was looking at my own. I stayed hidden outside as the service began. The pastor spoke kindly about my life, saying I had been a hard-working son who always put his family first. Guests nodded while wiping tears from their eyes. My mother cried into a handkerchief. My father accepted hugs from friends and thanked everyone for their support. My brother stood quietly beside them, pretending to be heartbroken. Watching them perform their grief felt more painful than anything the storm had put me through. One by one, relatives walked to the front and shared stories about me. They spoke as if I had already been buried beneath the ground. They told everyone how much they loved me and how deeply they would miss me. Listening from outside, I wanted to scream that I was alive. I wanted to run inside and force them to explain everything. But something stopped me. None of this felt rushed or accidental. It felt carefully planned. Near the church entrance, a donation table had been set up with my photograph beside a box for memorial contributions. People placed envelopes filled with money inside while offering sympathy to my family. I couldn't understand any of it. No search team had looked for me. No official investigation had confirmed my death. Yet somehow they had skipped every step and gone straight to burying me. Standing there, hidden from everyone, I realized this funeral wasn't about mourning me. It was about convincing the entire world that I would never come back, that I stayed hidden until the last guest slowly left the church. People hugged my parents one final time before driving away, still believing they had just attended the funeral of a man who was standing only a few steps away. I waited patiently behind the trees, trying to understand everything I had seen. My mind was filled with questions that had no answers. Why had my family buried me without proof? Why had nobody searched for me? And why did everything about this day feel so carefully organized? Just as I was about to leave, I noticed someone standing alone near the side entrance of the church. It was my mother's older sister, Aunt Lethabome Becca. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't talking to anyone. She kept looking around as if she was waiting for someone. Then, without warning, her eyes met mine. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. I expected her to scream, cry, or faint after seeing me alive. Instead, she calmly walked toward me. There was sadness on her face, but there was no surprise. When she finally stood in front of me, she quietly said, "I knew this day might come." Her words sent a chill through my body. Before I could ask what she meant, she reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick sealed envelope. She held it tightly for a moment before placing it in my hands. "Your mother made me promise something years ago," she whispered. "She told me that if you ever came back after everyone believed you were gone, I must give this to you immediately. I was never allowed to open it. I was only supposed to protect it until this day." My hand shook as I carefully opened the envelope. Inside were several official documents, insurance papers, property records, bank statements, and a small bundle of handwritten letters. Every page seemed connected to my name. I quickly noticed something that made my heart race. There were insurance claim forms that had already been processed after my supposed death. Someone had officially applied for money that should never have been paid while I was still alive. I kept reading, and each document revealed another disturbing piece of the truth. There were legal papers showing attempts to transfer property, financial records connected to my death, and notes written in my mother's handwriting. She had warned that greed inside the family would one day become dangerous. She feared that some relatives cared more about money than about the people they claimed to love. As I finished reading the first letter, I looked up at Aunt Lethabo. Tears filled her eyes as she quietly nodded. She didn't need to explain anything. The envelope had already told me enough. My family hadn't simply accepted that I was dead. Someone had gained something from making sure the world believed it. The envelope changed everything. Until that moment, I still hoped there had been some terrible misunderstanding. But after reading those documents, I knew I couldn't trust anyone. I needed proof, not guesses. If someone had planned my death on paper, then they had also left behind evidence. I decided to quietly investigate before letting anyone know I was alive. With Aunt Lethabo's help, I started collecting every document connected to my disappearance. The more I searched, the more disturbing the truth became. Nothing had happened by accident. Every step had been carefully arranged to make it look as though I had died during my offshore assignment. One of the first things I found was a witness statement signed by a distant relative. According to the document, he claimed to have spoken with people who supposedly saw my vessel disappear during the storm. But when I checked the dates, his story didn't make sense. He had never even been anywhere near the coast. His statement was based on rumors, yet it had been treated as fact. Then I discovered copies of travel records that showed my expected return date had been changed. Someone had made it appear as though I had missed my scheduled arrival by several weeks. That small change helped convince everyone that something terrible had happened to me. Anyone reading those records would naturally believe I had vanished without a trace. As I continued digging deeper, I found printed messages and written reports that repeated the same heartbreaking story again and again. Every version claimed I had most likely died at sea. None of them included real evidence. They were filled with words like believed, assumed, and presumed. Yet people accepted those reports without asking a single question. The lie spread through our community with incredible speed. Friends called one another. Neighbors shared the news. Distant relatives passed the story to people who had not seen me for years. Before long, everyone believed I was gone. The shocking part was that no one had ever contacted my company to confirm what had really happened. No official rescue report had been released. Nobody waited for facts because my family spoke with complete confidence, and people trusted them. The more evidence I gathered, the more one thing became clear. This wasn't a story created in panic after a storm. It had been built piece by piece, with every false statement supporting the next one. Someone had taken the time to remove every doubt before anyone could question it. Looking at the growing pile of documents on the table, I felt a painful truth settle in my heart. My disappearance had not created the lie. The lie had been ready long before I ever came home. Whoever planned this had expected one thing with complete confidence: that the Bonnie Nkosi would never walk back through the door alive. Late that night, after hours of reading through the documents, I found one envelope that looked older than all the others. The paper had turned slightly yellow, and my name was written on the front in handwriting I recognized immediately. It was my mother's writing. For a long moment I simply stared at it. She had passed away several years earlier, and seeing her handwriting again made my eyes fill with tears. It felt as if she was somehow reaching across time to speak to me one last time. With trembling hands, I carefully unfolded the letter and began reading. "My dear Thabani," it began. "If these words ever reach you, it means the future I feared may have finally arrived." I stopped for a moment, unable to believe what I was reading. My mother had written this letter years before her death, yet it felt as though she knew exactly what would happen. She explained that over the years she had quietly noticed changes within the family. Small disagreements about money slowly became arguments. Simple conversations about property became secret meetings. She never accused anyone directly, but she admitted that greed had begun changing people she once trusted. She worried that after she was gone, some relatives would value land, houses, and bank accounts more than honesty or love. The letter said she prayed every day that she would be wrong. She hoped the family would stay united and protect one another. But deep inside, she could never ignore the warning in her heart. That was why she decided to prepare for a future that no one else knew about. As I continued reading, I found the answer hidden among the legal papers. Years before her death, my mother had worked quietly with a trusted lawyer to protect everything she owned. Important properties, savings, and investments had been placed into secure legal arrangements. Clear instructions had been written that prevented anyone from claiming those assets through false documents, pressure, or manipulation. Every transfer required undeniable proof and strict legal approval. Attached to the letter were certified copies of those agreements. My mother had even written personal notes explaining why each document existed. She wanted to make sure that if anyone ever tried to use lies or deception to steal what belonged to me, the law itself would stand in their way. By the time I reached the final page, tears were running down my face. My mother had protected me long before I even knew I needed protection. She couldn't stop people from betraying me, but she had made sure they could never truly win. As I carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope, I realized something powerful. My family may have planned my funeral, but my mother had planned for the truth. Even after her death, she had left behind the one thing that could expose every lie they had built. The day finally came when I could no longer investigate in secret. With the help of my lawyer and the documents my mother had protected, I officially reported that I was alive. The news spread across the city within hours. People who had attended my funeral couldn't believe what they were hearing. Soon, the case reached the courtroom, where every question that had haunted me would finally have to be answered. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, neighbors, old friends, and curious members of the public filled every seat. My family sat together on one side of the room, avoiding my eyes. Some looked nervous. Others tried to remain calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. I quietly took my seat with my lawyer, wondering how the people who had buried me would explain seeing me walk into court alive. When the judge entered, the room became completely silent. The hearing began with one simple fact. I stood up, showed my identification, and officially confirmed my identity. The judge looked directly at me before turning toward the documents already placed on the bench. "If this man is alive," the judge asked calmly, "how was his death accepted without proper confirmation?" No one answered. My lawyer then presented the first pieces of evidence. Certified financial records showed that insurance claims had been filed shortly after I was reported missing. Bank documents revealed that people had already begun trying to access money connected to my supposed death. Property records showed attempts to transfer valuable assets before any official investigation had even been completed. One document, after another, exposed a different contradiction. Dates didn't match. Statements conflicted with travel records. Witnesses claimed events happened on days when they couldn't possibly have been there. The carefully planned story that had seemed so believable outside the courtroom suddenly began falling apart under simple questions. The judge leaned forward and studied every page carefully. Then came another question that filled the courtroom with silence. Who authorized funeral arrangements before receiving official proof of death? Again, nobody answered. My family's lawyer tried to argue that everyone believed I had died during the storm. But the judge quickly pointed out that belief was not evidence. There had been no confirmed body, no completed investigation, and no legal declaration supported by proper facts before important financial actions had already started. I watched my parents lower their heads as more documents were placed before the court. Every new record made the timeline even harder to explain. The truth was becoming impossible to hide. For the first time since I returned home, I felt something changing. The lies that had erased my life were no longer being whispered behind closed doors. They were being examined one by one in open court. And as the judge continued asking difficult questions, everyone in that courtroom realized the same thing. The man they claimed was dead had returned, and now their story was the one fighting to survive. As the court hearing continued, The confidence my family had shown at the beginning slowly disappeared. The evidence was becoming too strong to ignore. Every new document raised another question, and every question exposed another crack in the story they had worked so hard to build. The truth was no longer hiding in private conversations. It was unfolding in front of everyone. The first witness walked to the stand looking nervous. During the earlier investigation, he had confidently claimed that he heard I had been swept away during the storm. But when my lawyer showed him phone records and the dates of those conversations, he became quiet. After several moments of silence, he finally admitted that he had never actually known what happened to me. He had simply repeated what my family told him because they sounded so certain. That confession changed everything. One after another, other witnesses began changing their statements. A family friend admitted that he had been asked not to question the story because it would only make the family's pain worse. Another relative confessed that she had shared false information on social media, without checking whether it was true. None of them had seen proof that I was dead. They had only trusted the people who claimed to know the truth. Then my lawyer presented copies of old text messages recovered from several phones. The courtroom became completely silent as each message was read aloud. Some relatives discussed insurance money before any official confirmation of my death. Others talked about dividing property and deciding who would move into my apartment. One message even said, "Everything should be settled before anyone starts asking too many questions." The judge slowly looked up from the papers, his expression growing more serious with every page. Next came the financial records. Bank transfers showed that money connected to my supposed death had already started moving between accounts. There were requests to release insurance payments, discussions about selling property, and conversations about future expenses that depended on me never returning. It became painfully clear that some people had already begun planning their lives around the benefits they expected to receive after my funeral. I sat quietly, listening as every lie unraveled piece by piece. The people who once spoke with complete confidence could no longer keep their stories straight. Every answer created another contradiction. Every excuse led to another difficult question. By the end of the hearing, the perfect story my family had built was gone. It hadn't collapsed because of anger or revenge. It collapsed because the facts refused to support their lies. The courtroom no longer saw a grieving family that had made an honest mistake. It saw a carefully planned deception that could no longer survive the truth. When the court hearings finally came to an end, many people expected me to celebrate. Others thought I would stand outside the courthouse and publicly shame every member of my family. After everything they had done, no one would have blamed me for wanting revenge. They had erased my life, buried my name, and convinced the world that I was dead. For a long time I believed I would never be able to forgive them. But as I walked out of the courtroom, I remembered my mother's letter. She had never told me to hate anyone. She had never asked me to destroy the people who betrayed us. Instead, she wrote that the greatest victory would always be living an honest life, no matter how dishonest others became. Those words stayed with me as I looked back at the courthouse one last time. I realized something important. My family had already lost something far greater than money or property. They had lost trust. The people who once believed every word they said now looked at them with disappointment. Friends stopped defending them. Neighbors no longer admired them. They would have to live with the choices they had made. And no punishment I could imagine would ever be heavier than that. Instead of spending my energy chasing revenge, I decided to rebuild the life they had tried to erase. The first step was restoring my reputation. With the court's decision and official records corrected, my bank accounts were reopened, my identity was legally confirmed, and my name was cleared. My company welcomed me back after learning the full truth. Many of my coworkers apologized for believing the false reports, and I accepted their apologies because they had been deceived just like everyone else. Slowly, I began putting my life back together. I found a new place to live instead of returning to the apartment filled with painful memories. I surrounded myself with people who had supported me without expecting anything in return. Every small step forward reminded me that my future was still mine to build. Sometimes people asked if I planned to speak publicly about everything my family had done. I always gave the same answer. The truth has already spoken for itself. I didn't need to embarrass anyone because the facts had already done that. As for my family, they were left to face the consequences of their own decisions. Relationships they had damaged could not be repaired overnight. The respect they had thrown away could not simply be earned back with apologies. Those consequences belonged to them, not to me. For the first time in months, I felt something I thought I had lost forever. It wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was peace. I finally understood that the best way to honor my mother's memory was not by holding on to the past, but by building a future that no lie could ever take away again. Several months passed after the court case ended, and my life slowly became peaceful again. The pain of everything that had happened never completely disappeared, but it no longer controlled me. Instead of looking back every day, I started looking forward. I remembered my mother's final wish, that whatever she left behind should one day help people build better futures. I decided it was finally time to make that dream come true. Using the inheritance she had carefully protected, I opened a maritime training foundation near the coast. It was a place where young men and women could learn valuable skills for working at sea, from engineering and cargo operations to safety training and navigation. Many of the students came from families that struggled financially, just as mine once had. I wanted them to have opportunities that could change their lives without ever losing their honesty along the way. On the first day the foundation opened, the training hall was filled with excited students. Some had traveled hundreds of miles just to attend. As I walked onto the stage to welcome them, I noticed several familiar faces in the audience. They looked at me with wide eyes, almost unable to believe what they were seeing. After the speech, one young man approached me with tears in his eyes. "I thought you were dead," he said quietly. "I remember reading your obituary. I even prayed for your family." I smiled gently and nodded. "So did many other people," I replied. "But sometimes the truth takes longer to arrive than the lies." The room became silent as I shared my story. I didn't speak about anger or revenge. Instead, I spoke about courage, patience, and never giving up when people try to define your future for you. I told them that life would sometimes test them in ways they could never imagine, but the truth always has a way of finding the light. As the months passed, the foundation continued to grow. More students enrolled, more families found hope, and every graduation reminded me that something good had come from the darkest chapter of my life. My mother's kindness continued to touch lives through the dream she had protected years before. Sometimes I would stand outside the training center and watch the students laughing as they prepared for their futures. In those quiet moments, I finally understood what everything had taught me. My family had held my funeral long before my life was over. They believed they had buried my future, my name, and my dreams. But they were wrong. The man they tried to erase was still standing. The life they thought had ended had only just begun. And in the end, they never buried me. They buried the lies they had built around me, while I walked away alive, carrying nothing but the truth and the future that no one could ever steal again.